Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, April 25th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Biden is preparing for Ukrainian offensive to fail. So, the Biden administration is preparing for the possibility of Ukraine's long awaited counteroffensive failing. And this is according to a report from Politico on Monday. Pentagon documents allegedly leaked by Airman Jack Teixeira revealed that the U.S. does not believe Ukraine can regain any significant territory in its counteroffensive, which is expected to be launched sometime this spring. The information in the leaks was based on an assessment made in February. Now, according to this Politico report, more current assessments also don't expect much Ukrainian success. Two Biden administration officials said that they don't think Kiev has the ability to sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea in the Kherson and Zaporozhye oblasts in the south there. The report said U.S. intelligence, quote, indicates that Ukraine simply does not have the ability to push Russian troops from where they were deeply entrenched, end quote. Zelensky himself said in March that his forces needed more Western weapons before they can launch a counteroffensive, saying that they need even more assistance than they've received already. So the administration they're expecting to face criticism in the event of a Ukrainian failure from both hawks who believe that Biden has not given Ukraine enough weapons, for the ones calling for them to send fighter jets and the longer range missiles. And they also expect to come under fire from people who have been calling for diplomacy, for the U.S. to push for diplomacy. And the U.S. is also worried that many of its European allies will favor negotiations between the warring sides if Ukraine's offensive fails. So, since Russia invaded Ukraine last year, the administration has discouraged peace talks, as I've covered a lot, and recently came out against the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine. The administration has left it up to Zelensky when to pursue peace talks, and he still maintains that they cannot happen until Russia is driven out of all the territory that it controls, including Crimea. But now, according to this Political report, there is a discussion among administration officials about convincing Ukraine to accept more modest goals and agree to a ceasefire that could mean more fighting in the future. So the way that they want to sell it to Ukraine is that, if you accept a ceasefire now, we could give you more military aid for an offensive in the future, and possible incentives for Ukraine to accept something like this include giving them NATO-like security guarantees and, again, more military aid. And this is according to the officials who spoke to Politico. So the issue with this plan is that Russia has signaled it will not settle for a frozen conflict and has stated that it can only achieve its war goals by military means. I don't think Russia would go for, like a frozen conflict situation that included, NATO countries, boosting support for Ukraine or offering any kind of security guarantees. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov recently reiterated that one of Russia's main priorities is keeping Kiev out of NATO. And that came after NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that Ukraine's rightful place is in the alliance. So looking back, hopefully I'm wrong here, and that, China, and I think that those countries like China and Brazil that are pushing for peace talks, maybe they'll have some success. I can't really see any U.S. idea really working out here. Russia really settling for anything like that. Hopefully I'm wrong. But if you just look back at the conflict in the early days of the Russian invasion, that was when Russian and Ukrainian officials were engaged in peace talks for the first month or so there. And Moscow's primary demand was for Ukrainian neutrality. But now, over a year later, Kiev stands to lose much more as Russia maintains that any settlement must include recognizing the areas it annexed in the Donbass, Kherson, and in the Zaporozhye. So territorially, I think there was still a lot of details to work out, but what Russia was asking for was neutrality and some sort of guarantee when it comes to NATO membership. And they said they would pull back to the lines, the pre-invasion lines. But now um, Ukraine stands to lose a lot more, and a lot more people are dead. So I think if it does show that Ukraine, if they can't regain any territory, I think this report is probably right that the Biden administration is going to come under more pressure to kind of say, okay, what's the goal here? All right, the next one here. Ukraine postponed attacks inside Russia due to U.S. pressure. So the Washington Post reported on Monday that Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, known as the HUR, was planning major strikes inside Russia in February that were postponed due to U.S. pressure. The report cited documents allegedly leaked by Teixeira, and according to a report from the National Security Agency, HUR Chief Major General Kirlo Budanov instructed one officer, quote, to get ready for mass strikes on the 24th of February with everything the HUR had, end quote. So that date that, this attack would have coincided with the first anniversary of the Russian invasion. So the U.S. became aware of these plans because the U.S. has been spying on Ukrainian officials. That's how they acquired this intelligence. And according to a CIA report dated February 22nd, the HUR had agreed at Washington's request to postpone the strikes. And the Washington Post report said it was not clear how the U.S. exactly pressured them to push back these operations. So throughout the war, Ukraine has launched small drone attacks and conducted other sabotage operations inside Russia. And so it's not really clear what they meant by mass strikes that they wanted to conduct. And, they said they postponed the attack, and there's been more of these drone strikes and shelling in Russian regions that border Ukraine, but nothing, major. But one plan that was mentioned by the Post was using TNT to attack the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk, so the Russian port there. So maybe, that's something it doesn't look like Ukraine has done. So just not exactly clear what their big plan was. And this report, it suggests that the U.S. did not want Ukraine to go ahead and launch these attacks inside Russia over concerns of a Russian escalation. But there are indications that the U.S. has helped Kiev with other attacks inside Russia. If you remember, in December, Ukrainian drones hit airfields that were deep inside Russia. NATO military sources told Asia Times that the drones used U.S. satellite GPS data to hit their targets, despite Biden administration claims that the U.S. did not encourage nor enable the attacks. So I think that there is a good chance that the U.S. has helped Ukraine in some way in their attacks inside Russia. And another leaked document that was first reported on, when these leaks first came out, suggested that Zelensky would use long-range U.S. weapons to hit targets inside Russia, despite assurances that he wouldn't. And this document said that Zelensky expressed concern that Kiev did not possess long-range weapons to hit Russian targets in Rostov during a conversation with his commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny. And this goes against, again, Ukrainian officials always saying, if you send us these longer-range missiles like the ATACMS that have a range of up to 190 miles, which would double what they have now, they're saying we won't use them to attack inside Russia. But here you have Zelensky sounding like, he would. All right. So the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. The EU and Japan reject Washington's proposal to ban exports to Russia. So an American plan to strengthen its economic war against Russia by banning all exports has not been well received by its allies. According to the Financial Times, the European Union and Japan have pushed back against ending trade with Moscow. So Washington's new proposal on the sanctions would be how the sanctions are enforced against Moscow. Currently, the U.S. and its allies blacklist particular Russian products, companies, and individuals. But this new thing that they're pushing would be basically a trade ban. It would ban all exports unless there's an explicit exemption. And as we know with sanctions, even though there are exemptions, it still usually reduces, trade in those with those goods, and that's usually medicines and things like that that are exempt. But the sanctions still cause shortages. So on Monday, this is according to the Financial Times, Japan and the EU are they reported that they're refusing to sign on to this plan. Washington was hoping to implement the export ban at the G7 summit in Hiroshima on May 19th. One unnamed official told the Financial Times that it is not doable. So it looks like there's going to be a lot of resistance to this plan that the U.S. is pushing here. But I'm sure they're going to announce some sort of increasing in sanctions on Russia at that summit, whether it's just symbolic or not. All right, the next one here, Taiwan is in talks with the U.S. about arms stockpiles. So Taiwanese Premier Chen Chien-jen confirmed on Monday that the U.S. and Taipei are in talks about establishing a contingency stockpile of weapons for a future fight with China located on or near the island of Taiwan. So Chen said, quote, the proposal of regional contingency stockpiles is still in the negotiation process, end quote. So the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act that President Biden signed into law in December, it included several measures to increase support for Taiwan, including the authorization to spend $100 million each year on a regional contingency stockpile of arms for Taiwan. Chen said that the U.S. and Taiwan have been in talks on the issue since the NDAA became law. Beijing is strongly against growing military ties between Washington and Taipei, and they launched major military exercises around Taiwan when Biden signed this NDAA into law. So Taiwanese officials will not say if the plan is to establish the stockpile in Taiwan or at a base elsewhere in the region, such as one of the bases in Okinawa. If the stockpile is located in Taiwan, it likely would not be publicized over concerns of provoking a Chinese response. According to Taiwan's news agency CNA, I thought this was interesting. They said that the U.S. has experienced stockpiling weapons in Taiwan as it established depots on the island that were used in bombing missions during the Vietnam War. If the U.S. reestablishes a stockpile in Taiwan, they expect the U.S. to build a new facility or expand an existing one. And that's something that would really anger China, just the U.S. building, military facilities on Taiwan. So it's definitely, this arrangement is something to keep an eye on. All right, the next one here, U.S. rehearses war with China on the Philippine islands south of Taiwan. So hundreds of U.S. Marines and U.S. Army soldiers participated in military exercises on the Philippine island of Baton, which is just 100 miles across the Bashi Channel from Taiwan. So the drills are part of the Balikatan exercise, which is being touted as the largest ever joint military exercises between the U.S. and the Philippines. It comes after the U.S. inked a deal expanding its military presence in the Southeast Asian nation, and this is all part of Washington's plan to prepare for a future conflict with China. So if you're watching the video, I just put in a Google map here that just shows where this island is. This is this little piece sticking out here is the Philippines, the mainland Philippines, and they have a lot of these islands to the north. So this is pretty close to Taiwan. It's just over 100 miles away from the island, about the distance of the Taiwan Strait to the mainland. So the U.S. was up there with their troops conducting drills, and this iteration of these Balikatan exercises, it marked the first time that they brought them, that they did these drills to on the Philippines' northern islands. Major General Joseph Ryan, who's the commander of the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry Division, he told the Financial Times that the Philippines was inclined to demonstrate defense of the island due to, quote, the insidious nature of the People's Republic of China. He went on, quote, we're expanding our posture to this island here on the South China Sea near Taiwan. Doing both of these things, we're demonstrating our will to help our allies and partners. This should be a signal to the PRC that we're serious, end quote. Financial Times also spoke with locals who expressed concern about the drills. Some Filipinos are worried that the growing military relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines could drag Manila into a war with China. According to the Wall Street Journal, the American troops carried Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles during the drills, which took place in the town of Basco on the island of Bataan, which, so if you look at the island, Bosco is the northern town on the island, so closer to Taiwan than other parts. And a HIMARS rocket system was also set up on the opposite side of the island. And the HIMARS rocket systems could be used to target ships hundreds of miles away. So, all part of this preparation for war with China. And the next one here is more about that. Australia is planning a major military overhaul that is aimed at China. So, a government review of Australia's military capability has called for Canberra to make sweeping changes to better prepare for a future conflict with China, which is Australia's largest trading partner. So, according to Australian media, the review has triggered one of the greatest shifts in Australia's military since World War II. The review was conducted by former Australian Defence Minister Stephen Smith and Angus Houston, who previously served as the head of the Australian Defence Forces. Smith and Houston said that Australia has entered the missile age and is no longer protected by its isolated geographic location. They called for Australia to invest in more long-range missiles and drones and to boost domestic weapons manufacturing. The Australian government of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has endorsed the review and said that it would increase military spending to fulfill the recommendations. The review called China's current military buildup, quote, the largest and most ambitious of any country since the end of the Second World War. This buildup is occurring without transparency or reassurance to the Indo-Pacific region of China's strategic intent, end quote. The review said that as a consequence of China's buildup, quote, for the first time in 80 years, we must go back to fundamentals to take a principle-first approach as to how we manage and seek to avoid the highest level of strategic risk we now face as a nation, the prospect of major conflict in the region that directly threatens our national interest, end quote. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning hit back at the characterization of Beijing's military modernization. She said, quote, we do not pose a challenge to any country. We hope certain countries will not use China as an excuse for military buildup and will refrain from hyping up the China threat narrative, end quote. So the release of the Australian review, it comes after the US, Britain, and Australia announced their nuclear-powered submarine plans under the AUKUS military pact, which the three countries signed in 2021. And it's meant, it's aimed at China. They're going to use these submarines to patrol the waters near China. And under this plan, Australia is eventually going to be able to make their own. They're getting the technology to make them. First, they're going to buy some subs from the US and the UK. And Australia also fits into the Quad, which is a four-nation group that includes the US, Japan, and India. And Hawks in Washington look at the Quad as a potential foundation for a NATO-style alliance in the Asia-Pacific. And the U.S. has been encouraging its allies in the region to boost their military capabilities. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin welcomed the news from Australia. He said in a statement, quote, it is the latest example of the pivotal role Australia plays in preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific, including through participation in AUKUS and the Quad, end quote. Austin added that the review, quote, demonstrates Australia's commitment to being at the forefront of incorporating new capabilities for the Australian Defence Force to better enable Australia to meet regional and global challenges, as well as to our unbreakable alliance, which has never been stronger, end quote. And Australia's announcement comes a few months after Japan unveiled its plans to dramatically increase its military capability by doubling its defense budget. Tokyo's plans are also specifically aimed at China. So we just keep seeing countries and the U.S. and its allies moving in this direction. There's just no hiding the fact that they're all preparing for war with China, of course, in the name of deterrence and preventing a war. But it seems like they're going to will a war into existence here. So I just want to take this moment to mention it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com. And I just want to read a little bit of this letter that Ted Galen Carpenter wrote for us. Again, he's one of our guys. He was a columnist for us for a while. Now he's a senior fellow at the Randolph Bourne Institute, which is our parent company. And he was let go from Cato after working there for 37 years because of his stance on the war in Ukraine. I mean, it goes to show there's not many places like antiwar.com. And As Ted puts it in this letter, antiwar.com has long been the most dedicated, principled, and unflinching opponent of the powerful bureaucratic war machine that continues to drag Americans into disastrous armed conflicts around the world. Most press outlets are willing conduits of Washington's pro war propaganda. Antiwar.com, by contrast, has redoubled its efforts to expose and counter the tsunami of misinformation flowing from the U.S. government and its accomplices in the establishment press. Despite being massively outspent by the opposition, it has been surprisingly successful in fulfilling that mission. So go to antiwar.com/donate. You can see all the ways you can support us. You can make a one-time donation, set up a monthly recurring donation, make a special donation, all sorts of ways you could help us out. So please, if you can manage it, go to antiwar.com/donate. And back to the news here. Still got a lot of stuff to go over. This next one is from Kyle again at the Libertarian Institute. Record American military spending tops next 11 countries combined. So global weapon expenditure hit a record $2.24 trillion in 2022, an increase of nearly 4%. An international watchdog found the trend is led by European countries returning to Cold War level spending. The U.S. remained the world's largest spender on war. So this is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. They released their annual report, finding worldwide military expenditures increased for the 8th consecutive year. This person from SIPRI said, quote, "The continuous rise in global military expenditure in recent years is a sign that we are living in an increasingly insecure world," end quote. So European military expenditure has increased by 13% in that year. That's pretty significant. And for many nations on the continent, weapons expenditures increased to levels not seen since the Cold War. Finland upped it by 37%, Lithuania by 27%, Sweden by 12%, Poland by 11%. They all increased their military spending by more than Russia, which saw a 9.2% bump as it fought a war in Ukraine. Kiev saw its year-to-year war spending increase by 640%. According to SIPRI report, American military spending continues to smash records. The nearly $20 billion in weapons Washington shipped to Kiev last year is the largest amount of security assistance one country has ever provided to another in a single year. Additionally, the U.S. was the world's largest military spender at $877 billion. That amount is more than the total military spending of the next 11 highest spending countries. Many of the other top spending nations are allies of Washington. Military expenditures among NATO members topped $1.23 trillion. So that's a lot of money. And, I think it shows what we're up against at antiwar.com, because a lot of that spending goes into, propaganda and psyops and things like that. So, that's what we got to deal with. All right, the next one here. U.S. ships and drones are positioned near Sudan to help fleeing citizens. So the U.S. military has drones and ships deployed near Sudan to help Americans looking to flee the country after U.S. Special Operations Forces evacuated embassy personnel from Khartoum. So Pat Ryder, who's the Pentagon spokesman, he said that the Pentagon and U.S. Africa Command were working with the State Department on the situation in Sudan, where forces loyal to rival generals have been fighting in the capital. Ryder said, quote, "Those efforts include providing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities to observe potential land routes out of Sudan and detect threats, and positioning naval assets off the coast of Sudan should they be needed," end quote. He said the guided missile destroyer USS Truxtun is currently operating near Port Sudan, and another ship, the USS Polar, which is a mobile base vessel, is on the way. So there's another vessel being deployed there. Ryder said that U.S. drones are providing surveillance, but he would not provide further detail. He said, quote, "I'm not going to get into the specifics of the type of platform other than say we're providing unmanned vehicle overwatch," end quote. So about 100 special operations soldiers using 3 MH-17 helicopters carried out the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum. So this was just based on the Associated Press write-up. So yeah, I said MH-17. They're MH-47 helicopters. I have to fix that. No, that wasn't right. So they carried out the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum on Sunday. They flew about 70 embassy staff to an undisclosed location in Ethiopia. The State Department said that the U.S. would not attempt evacuating any of the thousands of U.S. citizens who are in Sudan, but their presence could potentially be used as pretext for further U.S. military intervention in the country. They have an excuse if they want to send troops in there, and they seem to be prepared for it. So, in a letter to Congress, President Biden explained the evacuation operation, and he said that it involved deploying troops to Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Sudan. He said U.S. military personnel will remain deployed in Djibouti to protect U.S. personnel and others until the security situation no longer requires their presence. And additional forces are prepared to deploy to the region if required. So the U.S., it sounds like the troops are out of Sudan and Ethiopia. They're just staying put in Djibouti, where the U.S. already has a big military presence. But it sounds like it's additional troops that are there in Djibouti. And Blinken, the Secretary of State, said on Monday that the rival generals, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and who is Sudan's army chief and the de facto leader of the country. So he's been fighting it out with Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who's the commander of the Rapid Support Forces. He was Burhan's deputy in the government, the military-led government. So Blinken is saying that they agreed to a 72-hour ceasefire that will start on Tuesday. And the warring sides, they've previously agreed to several failed ceasefires already. So who knows if this is going to hold. But he was saying that there was negotiations between the two sides. So we'll see what happens with that ceasefire. But definitely, the way the situation is right now, it does seem like there's a potential for the U.S. to get more involved in this conflict. All right, the next one here, Russia to host Syria and Turkish intel and defense chiefs. So Russia will host the meeting of intelligence and defense chiefs from Turkey, Syria, and Iran on Tuesday as part of an effort to work toward the normalization of relations between Ankara and Damascus. Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar announced the planned meeting that will be held in Moscow and said that the goal is to, quote, find a solution to the existing issues through talks and ensure peace and tranquility in the region as soon as possible, end quote. So this is Russia's effort to broker a normalization deal between Turkey and Syria. It started in December when the Turkish and Syrian defense ministers met for the first time since 2011. The talks were followed up with a meeting of the deputy foreign ministers of Turkey and Syria. So they've been in contact since then. And, this would be a pretty huge deal just because Turkey was all in on the regime change effort and still backs, anti-government fighters on the ground in Syria. And they have troops in northern Syria. So if they come to a deal, and Assad has said any settlement will require the withdrawal of Turkish troops. So it'll be a big deal, and it could lead, really to an end of this war. It might force the U.S. hand. This and other normalization efforts might force the U.S. to just have to give up on its sanctions and everything, and it might have to withdraw. Hopefully, that's the end result of all this dialogue and normalization talks. All right, the last one here, just this is from the South China Morning Post, and it's about how Biden and Yoon, the South Korean president, they're going to meet this week, and they're expected to discuss Taiwan and semiconductors. So the U.S. and South Korea just recently began discussing Taiwan openly, publicly, including it in joint statements. And of course, that angers China. One thing that's interesting, so Yoon, apparently he arrived in Washington on Monday. He's going to be there all week. That we might see some announcements of even more U.S. South Korean military drills. South Korea is looking for more guarantees when it comes to nuclear protection. So I'm sure we'll see some sort of announcements about that. But one thing that's interesting is about the semiconductors, because apparently China is considering, retaliation for the U.S. sanctions on their semiconductor industry, and they're considering banning Micron, which is a U.S. company, from selling chips. And there's reports that say the U.S. is trying to convince South Korea, okay, if they ban our company, you better not go in there with, your companies should not go in there and start selling, to fill that void. So they don't want South Korea to take the business, which is just interesting, and we will see how much South Korea goes along with the you know, economic efforts against China, because that is, a pretty big aspect of all of this tension between the U.S. and China. But that's it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter. A bad idea resurfaces using the U.S. military against Mexico's drug cartels. And that is a very, very bad idea. Unfortunately, a lot of Republicans are getting behind that idea. One from John V. Walsh. RFK Jr. takes strong anti war, anti empire stance in presidential run. One from James Bovard. Spy letter about Hunter Biden shows how Dems are undermining democracy. That's over at the New York Post. One from Stephen M. Walt. Ukraine and Russia need a great power peace plan. And that should be over at Foreign Policy. Yes, it is. And then our spotlight is from Caitlin Johnstone over at her website. Biden DOJ indicts 4 Americans for weaponized free speech, about the indictment against the Uhuru movement for their political views on Russia. But that's everything. Again, please go help us out with the fundraiser. Help us get off on the right foot. Antiwar.com/donate for that. And you can also support us just by sharing, telling people about us and sharing this show and all that stuff. But I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.